Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Ukraine war news update, first part thereof for the 19th of December 2023 as we inch further to Christmas Day. And indeed, it's worth noting that from a cultural point of view, the Ukrainians have moved towards the more Western religious calendar, seeing the 25th as Christmas Day, which is not what they previously did under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church. But I think, although that had happened, I think back in 2018, they decided to do that. They've more than confirmed it over the last year. I think putting it down in more official ways, so that I think they are attempting to move away from Russian influence, both culturally as well as kind of formally in terms of I guess institutions and mechanisms and structures and whatever else. They're moving away from that Russian sphere of influence, and this is in terms of when they celebrate Christmas Day, celebrate Christmas. So the 25th will be more, will have greater cultural impact going forward. Although there will still be many Ukrainians who will celebrate it. I forget, is it on the 6th of January? Is that when the Russian Orthodox Church does it? I know that in places like Spain and whatnot, that's the case, and elsewhere around Europe, Epiphany, so on. Anyway, whatever. But yeah, something to look out for. Right, sorry I'm a little bit late today. Just had a terrible night's sleep for no particular reason. Got up a bit later. So Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description to the video below. 1,140 personnel losses, a massive figure again for Russian losses in terms of troops. They are losing an awful lot, and I think if you add this together with the tanks 15, APVs 19, then this suggests that the Russians are still attacking in large waves up and down the front line in a number of different areas. This won't be as a result of Ukrainians exacting huge losses on the Russians by the Ukrainians attacking, although they are attacking in Krinky and the Russians are losing a fair bit of equipment around there. There's an awful lot of equipment being lost in the Russian columns and waves of attacks in places like Avdiivka, Mariinka, even Novomykhailivka, and up in Kupiansk near Sinkivka, and so on and so forth. 15 artillery systems as well, not as high as we saw yesterday, but it's been a bad 3 or 4 days for the Russians, as I guess... My guess is that there are clearer skies in the last few days that have allowed Ukrainian drones to be more prevalent and exact their toll on the Russian forces. 1 anti-aircraft warfare system, 20 vehicles and fuel tanks, and 2 pieces of special equipment. Vehicles and fuel tanks, we saw a massive loss for the Russians yesterday. There was one video I have on my on my browser I'm going to show you in a little while that shows just a ton of Russian vehicles like Bukanka, Scooby-Doo vans, Jeeps, trucks, SUVs, all destroyed by FPV drones. Just a montage, endless montage of stuff getting blown up. Just incredible. So there are huge losses. Andrew Perpetua has his list today. It's about a 2-to-1, maybe 2.5-to-1 loss ratio. No, probably about 2-to-1 loss ratio of Russian to Ukrainian losses there. We'll have a look at the different values of both sides here. So Ukrainians losing a couple of surveillance comms equipment on comms towers and a boat. AS-90 or Crab, I presume that's or, because the AS-90 is a British self-propelled gun. The Crab, HS Crab, is the Polish South Korean one. He did that yesterday. I don't know if that's a mistake or an unknown, whether it's one or the other. But you can see here that everything's been destroyed by drones, FPV drones, Lancets, or a drone drop bomb for the Ukrainians here. And that would suggest that the Russians are not using artillery as effectively as they previously were, but it also is going to be, as a result, selection bias. So there's just more evidence of drone activity that is always recorded. You're not always going to get artillery evidence of artillery strikes or gimlet strikes, I guess, or other types of equipment destruction. And so these lists will skew, I think, more likely to drones. However, with a lot of artillery destruction, you will have spotted drones, so you would expect there to be some. But anyway, I think it's The last statistic I saw was that drones were responsible for 40% of equipment losses. And that is a massive increase from where they started at the beginning of the war, which is probably 0%. They have taken more and more of the proportion of losses from artillery. And indeed, there's more news again. We've heard this before, but the Ukrainians are upping their production of FPV drones in light of the fact that they are not getting artillery ammunition to the extent that they need it from Western allies. So in light of that, they're like, well, we need more drones in that, and we can build more drones. We can build drones quicker than we can build artillery ammunition. So that is what they're doing. Anyway, the Ukrainians have lost a couple of bits of artillery, a few tanks, older tanks there. IFVs, they have lost the CV90, which is high. And here, it's interesting that for I don't know, there are too mmany IFVs. There is a BMP-1. I talked about BMP-1s not being seen for the Russians due to the fact that they are, I think, having to, they've got through many of their stockpiles to the point where the ones that have been easy to fix up and buff off and send to the front line, they've done so. And when they get to this point where they're having to fundamentally rebuild vehicles, they're going to rebuild the newer ones, the BMP-2s and 3s. That's not the case for the Ukrainians, who still have a large number of BMP-1s, and that's why you're seeing more BMP-1s here destroyed than for the Russians. In fact, that one BMP-1 there is the first one I've seen for probably a week in a Russian stat, so that's interesting. And they are just, and I'm fairly sure that's what's going on, which is that the Russians have used up their supply of easily fixable infantry fighting vehicles. But the Ukrainians are losing quite a lot of IFVs here compared to what we've seen, and that's probably a single bit of drone footage, a montage probably, or it might not be actually, because usually there's timestamps if it is a montage. Yeah, they lost a fair number of IFVs. I don't know what that signifies, where that would be, because you would assume that's the Ukrainians on the attack to lose that many sort of BMP-1s. And they're really only on the attack in Krinky, and they can't get those infantry fighting vehicles across the water, it seems. Although they are amphibious, I think it's just too difficult for them to land them easily across on the other side. It depends, the steepness of the banks and all that. But anyway, BMP-1s, BTRs, and a CV90. Now, for the Russians, it looks fairly high value here. There are 3 Buk air defense systems, all destroyed by Gimlers, and a Buk M3 here, the latest variant as well. So that will be fairly high value. Electronic warfare system, that R330 Jitel, destroyed by Gimlers as well, so HIMARS or similar, is a very high value piece of kit too. And we're on M, surveillance and comms, and we have a TOS-1A thermobaric munition there, destroyed by a drone drop bomb. That will be costly, and they've lost a number of those over the last week. I think we're maybe up to 3 in the last week of TOS-1As. And a T-90M tank, the latest variant of the T-90 tank. So that's the highest value tank that they could lose. They've lost one of them. And a few other bits and pieces, and an awful lot of civilian vehicles, which is in line with, and I said yesterday, it'll be interesting to see what Andrew Perpetua shows. There's a massive number of civilian vehicles that were listed on the general staff figures yesterday. It was huge. It was something like 50-something, I think. And I said, we're going to see a lot going forward, probably over the next 24, 48 hours from places like Andrew Perpetua. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we see. And so when we talk about these general staff figures, I still have pro-Kremlin trolls on my threads go, oh my goodness, you're still looking at the general staff figures from the Ukrainians. It's all just propaganda and lies. It's like, okay, well, first of all, what's going on with the Russian figures? Because they are literally physically impossible in certain categories. Literally physically impossible. And though I think there are overstated figures for the Russian general figures, particularly in aircraft and helicopters, that was a result of the beginning of the war. And I think somewhere around the middle of well, probably much earlier than the middle, actually, they started being a lot more accurate and had these criteria that you had to jump through in order to supply your figures to the general staff. And so we started to see, I think in the last 6 months, the aircraft figures have been pretty much 100% accurate. So although those are overcooked as a total figure, I think recently they're accurate, and all the other figures seem to be fairly accurate. At least they are consistently, if they are off, they're consistently off by the same amount. So there was that analysis that was done on Avdiivka that looked at the actual losses and the claimed general staff losses. And when they went up like this, when the actual confirmed losses went up and down like this, the general staff figures went up and down. And the question is, Do they marry up exactly, or is there consistently like a 5, 10, 20, 30% increase in what the general staff say? And I can't tell you now. All I can do is say that they do seem to be fairly accurate. Like when I present evidence to you, it does seem to confirm that at least they are taking heavy loss. So say when it was like 50 odd vehicles yesterday, and I say we'll see a spike in figures on Andrew Perpetua's list tomorrow, and that happens, like hugely that happens, then that gives me that gives credibility to these figures, right? So you're a troll if you're going to just laugh at me for using general staff figures if you present no evidence that they are overcooked. Like, fair enough, but the burden of proof is on you to show me that these are inaccurate, because I have spent 1.5 years showing you that they are broadly accurate, or at least if they are inaccurate, they're consistently inaccurate to the same level. And so that's why I often say, look, even if you took 30% off here, these are still really bad numbers. So, and I bet my bottom dollar they are not over egged by 30%, right? So I'm fine with continuing to use these figures on a daily basis until you present to me rationale that they are completely inaccurate. So someone who purports to be sort of accurate but is basically pro-Russian said, 30% off an imaginary figure is still an imaginary figure. It's like, no, mate, that's BS. You can't just say an imaginary figure and by that you're implying that they are complete nonsense, that they pulled this out their posterior. They haven't, and they've shown not to have done that. And I have heard first-hand accounts of drone operators saying that how they have to present their video evidence to their bosses and blah 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 to the general staff in order to get these figures on the general staff. So we have first-hand evidence. We've got open source intelligence evidence tracking them to suggest that these are accurate, and we have none of that for the Russian MOD, none whatsoever. We don't know what the criteria is for supplying figures to the Russian MOD, but we do know that the Ukrainians have to go through some hoops to supply their figures to the general staff. So I'm happy with using these. Don't attack these like a troll, because you'll be dismissed like a troll. If you want to attack these, come at me with some receipts, right? But for the time being, when Andrew Perpetua has his list here, if you go to the original list, there is a link to every single one of these. This isn't him just like writing stuff down. On the right-hand side, on the original spreadsheet, which is linked. So, if I take that back to the size it is, let's go and do that now. Let's go to the original spreadsheet. And the original spreadsheet has that link on the right-hand side, right? So for every time he tweets this out, go to the original Google Docs, and it is there. So these are all evidence, right? And he's talked about how he looks at damaged versus destroyed. You can go and check his videos out to where he discusses this. He is the one that decides that. It's none of his team. He is the... So the great thing there is you can disagree about what damage and what destroyed may mean, but it's going to be consistent right across all his stats, because he's the one that decides that. But anyway, that aside, I think, okay, let's just go back to these stats today. The Russians have lost an awful lot more stuff of higher value than the Ukrainians here, and I think it does help to confirm the general staff figures that we see on a daily basis. Right, I did a breaking news video yesterday on this. So this is a Morozovsk military airfield being hit by those drones 2 nights ago, and actually, although the initial damage assessment might have been that there was only one Su-34 that was damaged, saw some shrapnel damage to it. A Russian source came out and said actually 2 Su-34s were completely destroyed. 7, I think, another 10 received various damage as well, and that the Pantsir air defense system managed to take out 7 of the drones, which meant that 10 drones hit their targets and caused all sorts of explosions. So we have this BDA battle damage assessment that looks really significant. I said this is a game changer. If they can start using waves of drones that maybe are these cheap side drones to hit 300 kilometers into Russian territory, and to hit these jets that are causing such an issue for the Ukrainians in terms of dropping aviation, dropping the FOB 500s or 1,500s, as we're learning about. If they can take these out at source, then this is massively significant, and hopefully we'll see more nights of waves of Ukrainian drones that are indigenously manufactured and used to strike within Russian territory. This is huge news. Now, some Russian sources are trying to deny this Russian source and saying we're not going to believe it until, Fighter Bomber, which is another Russian source that often reports on this stuff, unless he reports it or whatever. So there is some kind of attempt to deny this, but if this has happened, that is truly significant and well worth looking at. So this was that video of total extermination of Russian transport in the Bakhmut area. So the inference here, or the implication, here, is that this is all in the Bakhmut area. And my goodness, as I said, there's a lot of vehicles that are blown up in this just minute-long montage. It's just the incredible prevalence of first-person view drones on the battlefield and how dangerous they are to pretty much everything. No matter what vehicle, if you get into anything that moves anywhere near the battlefield, anywhere near the front line, you'd be cacking it for being hit by drones. It's just, this is a drone war these days. Then there is footage, and unfortunately I can't play you lots of this footage, but there is footage of that R330 Z8 Jitel electronic warfare system getting taken out, and the radar for the Book 2 and the Book 3 complex being taken out by Gimlers. So this is fairly high value stuff getting taken out by HIMARS, which is good news for the Ukrainians, and it goes back to this list here to show you, this is justified and there's evidence for this, and the Russians appear to be losing some pretty high value stuff just there. So although I can't show you this, I can reference it, and remember, all the videos that I reference here are linked in the description below, so you can go and watch these at your own leisure. Here is a tank battle, and I say these are rare, but when they do turn up, it is worth looking at. And actually, there's been a couple of bits of footage of tank battles over the last week or so. Tank battle between a Ukrainian T-64BV, so that's an older Ukrainian tank, and a Russian T-72B3. There's a really interesting video. I'm going to dip into it in one of my extras. I'm so behind on extras, so sorry. But there's a British guy that gets into, I think it's in a Czech garage somewhere in Czechia, where he gets into a Russian T-72. And my goodness, that is a horrible tank in terms of moving around it, some of the design features, how difficult it is to just... Goodness me, if it's on fire inside, you're in trouble getting out that quickly. And indeed, if the barrel's in a certain place, you can't even get out of the front. You have to move through to the commander's area and up the hatch, and that barrel then the turret moves and it chops your legs off. And it's just, real tough tank to operate. But nonetheless, here we have a T-64BV against a T-72B3 near Bakhmut. The Russian tank gets hit and destroyed, while the Ukrainian tank gets targeted from three sides with ATGM fire, and luckily it misses 3 times. Footage is somewhat older, likely, but anyway, interesting tank-on-tank battle there. A Russian military and allied DNF forces lose an average of 5 to 6 DJI-type quadcopters during night flights due to icing conditions. So many high-level Russian commanders do not understand these icing conditions and are forcing crews to fly drones anyway. So icing is where you get droplets of water and it forms ice, and then that can cause problems going forward. And this is causing an issue for the Russians. Now, I would like to know whether this causes an issue for Ukrainian pilots as well, or whether there is an asymmetry here which works to the benefit of the Ukrainians. So if the Russians are getting if their commanders don't really understand icing conditions, are getting their drone operators to send up drones nonetheless, and they are losing 5 to 6 quadcopters during night flights due to that, then this is great for the Ukrainians. Russian blogger Zhivov has proposed creating HIMARS hunters units while describing the situation on the left bank of the Dnipro River. He says Ukrainian artillery is uncatchable at the moment and is taking apart the Russian advancing positions. So let's just dip into this. Regarding reaching the long-range artillery, operating at a depth of 10 kilometers or more from the Dnipro are HIMARS, MLRS, and various types of self-propelled howitzers. They, along with the enemy's drone teams, are the main headache in this area. The enemy is hitting the left bank with cluster munitions and charges with the remote mines. Enemy artillery is mobile. They fire and change positions. It is unrealistic to destroy them after a long series of vertical approvals that need to be executed. It is necessary to hunt for enemy artillery in real time. Quickly reveal positions during fire from the air or from the ground using surveillance and sound metering systems, and immediately launch a counter-battery strike. I mean, this is counter-battery fire, but they just don't have it, particularly in that area. Lots of Russian complaints about that. Easy to say, difficult to do, he says. To do this, you need to have a reserve. In reserve, a high-precision MLRS, Lancets, or an aircraft hanging in the air with an appropriate ammunition. A blow to the enemy must be struck immediately after detection without waiting until the conditional archer leaves for coffee. Simply put, we are returning once again to the issue of creating special teams of HIMARS hunters. In the future, the military army, with the means of high-precision means against enemy long-range artillery. Logically, our latest generation MLRS should cope with the task. Yeah, but where is it? Same complaints we're hearing from the Russians, particularly in that area. Counter-battery fire is just not adequate enough. Or just not adequate. So sabotage and resistance attacks continue almost every day somewhere in occupied Ukraine. So there's a lot of partisan activity in occupied Ukraine. Recently, the RAA Melitopol channel reports, yesterday, that there was an attempt made on this man, Pavlo Mischenko. Though he survived a car bomb, the ex-Ukrainian policeman was one of the first to collaborate with Russia, and that a cop from Krasnodar was wounded in a bombing of a disused school in Melitopol being used as a police station. So there are these partisan things that take place, activities that take place, operations on a daily basis. Russia on fire. Even Russia's trains are self-combusting now. So this was spotted at a railway station in Krasnoyarsk today. So that's been set on fire, and that'll be good. You know, those kind of logistics are important to disable, and that would be relatively low risk activity for partisans within Russia to do. We know that money is changing hands from a kind of leak or something came out, a newspaper article. It wasn't a leak, actually. It was actually a statement from someone within Ukrainian intelligence. It might even be Budnov. I can't remember now, but in the article it was something like, you know, there is money that goes into Russia to allow this to happen. I mean, you know, if you're a Russian that's on a breadline and someone says, here's $1,000 to go and set fire to that train, and there's no CCTV and basically you're going to get away with it, you probably think that there'll be a lot of Russians that would be pretty willing to do that. Anyway, here we move on to distance strikes and whatnot. A very quiet night, really. So one missile was shot down last night in the Dnipropetrovsk region, and two, it appears, Shahid drones were shot down. Very quiet night. And again, the question is, why a quiet night? Why would they have a night off? Why would they not have another wave of significant numbers of drones? Like, if I had those drones, if I was Russia, if I had those drones, I'd be using them every single bleeding night. Like, if I had endless supplies, if I had the huge stockpiles that they're supposed to have, then I would be firing 20, 30, 40 of these off a night. Because you want to exhaust those air defense systems, and you want to overwhelm them and then continue to overwhelm them. In fact, I wouldn't even wait a night. I would just continue overwhelming them. If I had... So obviously they don't have massive stockpiles, and I assume they're firing them at the rate that they are making them. And that means that they're getting them in daily and using them. Daily and using them, and then using two, because they've only got two. And they have to wait till another... They don't have the stockpiles there and then to use them. Otherwise, I don't understand. Like, you would send 30 or you would send 70. Like, if you had 70, don't send 30 one night and 40 the next night. Send 70 in one night. Which they have done. So we know they have at times sent. So recently they sent 75, right? That's because they had 75, obviously. But they didn't have 90. Otherwise they would have sent 90, I would have thought. So here, when they have two, they send two. That's because I would think, unless you can tell me any other reason, unless they don't have, you know, the only thing I can think is that they don't have 40 to send. Otherwise they would have sent 40. So... yes, they are stockpiling, but are they? I mean, are they now just using them at the rate they're using them? Now, in terms of missile stocks, it might be different, and they might be waiting for some massive wave of missiles, and you could argue that with with these, but then they've done that. A massive wave of 75 is the biggest one they've ever sent, and then it drops down. So, if they are waiting to stockpile enough so they have 75 again, it means that they don't have that many in stock. So they are just using them at the rate they are creating them. In other words, they don't have a stockpile of like hundreds of these, and they'll eventually stockpile up to 75 and then use all 75. But it's not like it's 75 out of 200 that they're using, because it doesn't make sense of the way they're using them. Russia's long-range missile stocks, based on Ukraine's reporting as of December the 18th. Russia is currently estimated to have around 550 caliber X-101, KH-555s, Iskander-K cruise missiles, 198 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, and 87 Kinzhals in stock. 87 Kinzhals is, these are their highly, much lauded hypersonic missiles, but actually they are vulnerable and they can get taken down. They used them against Khmelnytsky the other day. They have used them against Kiev, but I think 100% of the ones they use against Kiev have been shot down. So they can get shot down by Patriot, and I presume SAMP-T maybe as well. But yeah, so there are potentially a lot of missiles, but these might seem like a lot of missiles, but they have to have a strategic reserve. Just to remind you, I've talked about this previously. If they were to go to war with NATO or another country, like, this is not enough to commit to another war. It's as simple as that. Like, they would be absolutely, if Russia went to war with NATO anyway, right now, I think they'd lose a war against Poland. I think Poland, or at least a land war, Poland would be able to just knock Russia out with their present armed forces. So if Russia went to war with NATO, they'd be absolutely decimated. And they don't have the stocks that they would need to give, to commit to a massive war. They do have the stocks to do some serious damage to Ukraine, but how much of those strategic reserves are they happy to eat into? And I think they're probably, again, using these missiles at the rate that they are producing them. Anyway, moving on, Deutsche Welle, DW, the German media organization, their national media organization, showed a gunboat that protects Kiev from Shahed drones. So these are gunboats that are operating within Ukraine along rivers and lakes and whatnot. And you think, well, what are they doing there? Why do they need them? Actually, they act as quite mobile air defense systems. So this patrol boat has, big autocannons on board and whatnot. And according to Ukrainian defenders, Russia often routes missiles and drones along riverbeds to complicate the work of radars. So actually, these are really useful to have inland. And we have been hearing of patrol boats being delivered to Ukraine, but actually not seeing them on the Black Sea. And you're thinking, well, where are these patrol boats going? Actually, they are acting as mobile air defense systems, mobile in probably a much more effective and quick way. Although they can only go down certain routes, they can be pretty quick in doing so. So I imagine they're quite effective. Kherson region, the arrival of the Russian FAB aerial bomb here. I need to just refresh this browser. Now, I can't show you this because I'll get in trouble with demonetization and whatnot. But here is a use of an FAB 1,500 aerial bomb. It's a massive explosion. Unfortunately, in this direction, Russian aviation feels, so in Kherson, Dnipro River area, Russian aviation feels absolute impunity. And the majority of aerial bombs, they are dropped on average at 100 per day, arrive precisely on this sector of the front. Although we have heard from Russians that they aren't very precise. And in fact, they are quite often hit their own troops or just hit in the middle of a field. So I would caveat that, but they are using FAB 1,500, these are massive bombs. And that's why the Ukrainians need to be able to hit those air bases with those aircrafts within Russia that carry this aviation, or within Crimea. And that is why I said yesterday was potentially a game changer, bit of evidence that the Ukrainians might be able to halt this kind of activity by changing the behavior of the Russian VKS, their air force. Okay, explosions heard in Bryansk. Third such reporting this morning, but the loudest sounds heard in the city, and inevitably each time The governor says a UAV drone was destroyed, but they say all drones are destroyed, and then a couple of days later you hear that an airfield has had huge damage done to it. So, take what the Russians say with a pinch of salt here. And indeed, Moscow's carpet plan has been introduced. The carpet plan is where they shut down the airports and basically bring things to a standstill, and that means that drones are active. So I would imagine that there are Ukrainian drones being sent into the depths of Russia, and again, this fixes Russian air defenses in place and stops them from being brought to the front line, etc., etc., and also hopefully hits meaningful targets as well. Right, moving on to other bits and pieces. I'm not going to read this article, but this New York Times article has caused a bit of a stir, right? And the article is Ukrainian Marines on suicide mission in crossing Dnipro River, and it's one of these articles that kind of is very negative about the Ukrainian operations. In this case, in Kherson, Krinky, getting onto the left bank of the river. Big old article, lots to say. But it has been roundly criticised by some people in Ukraine, and we'll just dip into that. So the idea is this could be sensationalist, to paint a negative picture, to get clicks and get people up in arms. And actually, the Kiev Independent has a fairly similar. I don't know. I need to compare them to see whether they're actually using the same sources or whatnot. But the Ukrainian soldiers storming Eastern Bank and Dnipro fear their mission is hopeless. These two very similar articles, but there's a lot of people who have had a go at the New York Times here. And one of those people is Robert Magyar. So he has his Magyar's Birds. He's in charge of the drone, very famous drone unit that is operating in that area, and he's got this video. You can go and watch it. There's several people who have done translations. I'm actually going to read from a transcript to what he says, and I'll just read this to you. I think it's super important. I know it's going to take some time, but this is what he says back to that article and articles like this, because he has a massive pop at, say, The Spectator, which is a UK right wing. It's owned by the same group as Telegraph, Daily Telegraph, and it is he has a right go at Spectator for similar sorts of stuff and other news outlets. I appeal to you, dear NYT journalists. I don't want to infringe on your right to highlight your position, even if it's subjective, but this is criminal manipulation in pursuit of sensation, and I apologise, royalties. I am addressing you as a commander of the drone strike unit who has been performing combat missions every day since the first day of this operation, and whom the enemy, sparing no expense, personally hunts just like our crew, so hunts us. Capturing the emotional impressions of military personnel is normal. Okay for a Netflix movie. Filming them for a generalised rant about our positions is a shameful and criminal manipulation of conclusions and public opinion. Conclusions about the fallacy of the military plan, using the example of human misfortune. Why are you doing this? To explain the inappropriateness of transferring your weapons to us? 90% of the cost of which remains in your country boasts and strengthens your economy due to the presence of a constant order. So he's saying, why are you trying to paint all this in a negative light? Is it to have a go at you guys? Is it to build up criticism of supplying your weapons, to American weapons, to Ukraine? Well, 90% of the money for that stays in your country, and it supplies, it stimulates your economy. Why don't you comment on the unprecedented losses of the 104th Airborne Division of the Russian Federation on this small piece of land, about which the bunker grandfather, so Putin, said that there were no losses there, an entire division on this small bridgehead, as the enemy's speakers call it? Why aren't you talking about the declassed 810th Brigade of Russian Marines, which watered hundreds of hectares of land here with its blood? Why don't you investigate the strange fact of the liquidation of General Zvadsky, the former division commander of the Kantemorovskaya division, who allegedly was blown up by an enemy mine? Ukrainian society is very sensitive. Foreign society does not feel this war. Be careful in drawing conclusions, even if they seem very accurate and profitable to you. With your careless statements and your powerful mouthpieces for delivering information, you influence the fate of an entire population who are fighting for freedom and life. Secondly, I appeal to the military personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine. This group of journalists contacted me a few weeks ago. I did not allow myself to give them an interview despite the influence of this publication. And by the way, some of this is a transcript, but it's actually knocked out a bunch of stuff he says. It's much longer than this. And he lists all the equipment that his unit has destroyed in that area as well. So if you want to know how much he thinks he's destroyed in that area, it's quite a list of equipment. I appealed to the military personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine. This group of journalists contacted me a few weeks ago. I did not allow myself to give them an interview despite the influence of this publication. So those New York Times reporters came to him and he said, no, I ain't getting interviewed by you. Why? Over a cup of tea with ginger, I heard notes of interest in receiving messages about the feasibility of our fight on the left bank, about the correctness of the command's decisions. Taking these circumstances into account, I simply refused to participate in the conversation in order to prevent messages from being incompetent and not entrusted to me, which could be manipulated. In other words, he had heard that they were, the way I understand this is that the New York Times reporters were looking for, they wanted to write an article with already preconceived conclusions, which is that the command's decisions were to be questioned and that the feasibility of fighting on the left bank, it was unfeasible. So he was like, well, no, I'm not going to be part of an article that's going to look for those conclusions. And that's how I read that. 3, I'm addressing Ukrainians. The number of friendly steps that are now emerging one after another has grown catastrophically. Just what I read the night after this New York Times article came out takes on crazy proportions. I don't really know what he means there. But anyway, he's basically having a go at other nations. So Hungary is blocking aid. Austria is blocking sanctions. Poland is blocking its borders. And actually, in the original article, in the original rant that he has, and it is a bit of a rant, he goes into details of each of these things, talks about the Raiffeisen Bank, talks about Poland blocking aid on its borders, talks about Hungary. He says the US is rocking ahead of the elections. We have enough problems for us to still listen to these thousands of rants. Learn not to be fooled by those Western provocative messages with which they lull their society and abstract themselves from the problem on the NATO border. I appeal to the international community. Nothing extraordinary will happen in your warm Christmas homes this year. You will have cozy family dinners, gifts, skates, skis, calculation of salary bonuses, and everything inherent in the holiday program. But I ask you to remember that the problem that our aggressive neighbour created will echo back to you. Those who call themselves the civilized world, and experience has shown the flight time for that crap that is now flying across Ukraine is only a few minutes before you. Actually, in the original, I love the metaphor he talks about there. He says, when you have an earthquake, a tsunami that wipes out a certain place, the actual epicenter of that is thousands of kilometers away. And in other words, what he's saying is the tsunami that will hit you will have its epicenter thousands of kilometers away. So you might look at us as being thousands of kilometers away from you, but that earthquake that's happening in Ukraine will have effects in terms of tsunami on US shores later down the line. So it's like, in other words, you need to help us because it will come and bite you on the ass. I would advise going to listen to the whole thing. It is well worth it. I mean, it's 16 and a half minutes there of him talking. So that has been condensed down to this transcript. But there is actually lots more content in what he says and details of the losses that he's been responsible for. Okay. At the same time, so you then start seeing these sort of articles, which Ukrainians will be reading, right? And then you see this. Confidence in Zelensky has decreased from 84% in December 2022, this is a year ago, to 62% in December 2023. Trust in the government has dropped from 52% to 26%. Confidence in the police has also decreased from 58% to 41% now. But the armed forces still have a 96% confidence. So this has been worrying a lot of people, but actually Ilya Ponomarenko, who is a former Kyiv Independent journalist himself, says, I suggest that we don't overthink the figures provided with the latest poll. Yet Zelensky now has a 62% in popular support, while many got used to thinking about him as a universally acclaimed wartime leader. This was, of course, generally true for quite a long time. In December 2022, a year ago, Zelensky had 84%. That was around the 10th month of the Russian full-scale invasion, when public morale was very high. We had the Battle of Kyiv, we had the Kharkiv operation, we had Kherson liberated, and we are going through the winter of Russia trying to deprive us of heating and electricity, which was a strong consolidating factor. But of course, now we're about to enter the big war war's third year, and lots of things have happened in 2023 that take their toll on Zelensky's figures. The unsuccessful summer campaign in Zaporizhia, harsh military mobilization, Zelensky's own personal mistakes in the public domain and beyond. It's not March 2022 anymore, and the nation's passionate drive to unite behind a modern Churchill naturally settles down. Nonetheless, I still say 62% is still quite a lot, considering the fact that we had an extremely hard year at war that, despite many hopes, is not ending with a well-deserved victory and peace. Only 18% of Ukrainians say firmly that they do not trust Zelensky. General Zaluzhny, as we can see, enjoys very broad popular trust, 88%, which is, again, very predictable. He is a face of the Ukrainian military that is doing the impossible in its war. At this time, Zaluzhny has been very careful and consistent in the public domain. He carries his own burden of being responsible for 1 million lives under his command in the worst European war since World War II. And he, as a purely military leader, he does not deal with many things that fall on the head of his political civilian boss. And in my opinion, we can talk a lot about mistakes and setbacks, but General Zaluzhny deserves his fame and status as a prominent war leader of the 21st century. I'd like to see how successful his critics would be in a giant war against Russia, given how little resources Ukraine can count on since day one and what stands against it. As for other institutions, we in Ukraine have traditionally low trust in parliament, now 15%, or the government, now 26%. I don't remember a single parliament or cabinet about which we were happy for longer than the first few months. So no, dear Russian fanboys, Ukraine is not collapsing because only 62% endorse Zelensky. Ukraine is just not Russia. We don't have a dictator whose boots we must lick for 25 years. We're a democracy where we publish and discuss polls about Zelensky that he may not like, and we can be openly critical of Zelensky, the government, and the parliament, and where journalists can effectively overthrow ministers due to corruption scandals exposed. If you don't trust me, just spend like 10 minutes on Facebook's Ukrainian segment. There you go. And I think that's a really good riposte to that and to pro-Kremlin voices who are shouting about that change in polling. Now, the Kiev Independent says that Ukrainian military scales down some operations over foreign aid shortages. I reported this in my Frontline update yesterday, and I was actually attacked by people on Twitter like who are pro-Ukrainians who watch my videos to say, you're having too much of a go at US politicians and beating up on the US. I was like, if you're referring, and he said you're now doing it in your Frontline, and so if you're referring to this, I can't not report this. And this is like foreign aid shortages. You can join that to American aid shortages, fine, but like I can't not report this. Like this is what the Ukrainian commander is saying, and he is saying, and it's evident across the front line. They have stopped attacking. And there have been lots of claims that they're running out of ammunition. And then the commander comes out and says, Ukraine faces shell shortages and has to scale down some military operations due to a decrease in foreign aid, according to General Tarnavsky. Like, I can't not report that. So I'm not beating up on the US. The US has been insanely important in Ukraine's success thus far. Yeah. Russian prisoners who have returned from the front have already committed at least 27 murders, Die Welt quoted an investigation by the group agency as saying. Despite a general silence on the issue of brutality of returning veterans on part of the state propaganda, local Russian media have repeatedly reported on outbreaks of violence by former military personnel, often resulting in fatalities. Umerov, who's a defense minister for Ukraine, unveils new procurement agency as part of an anti-corruption effort. Defense minister has introduced in an opening presentation a new procurement agency. So there was trouble, and this is partly why Umerov came in, because Reznikov had to go due to some scandals to do with procurement. It wasn't him personally, but he kind of overlooked everything, so he eventually was moved on. That was obviously an issue, and they've now done this move to show that there's more transparency in procurement and it is in line with anti-corruption, I assume, anti-corruption legislation and moves in a need to get accession to the EU, and also in line with NATO too. A high-ranking Russian military official has fled to the Netherlands and is willing to surrender to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and testify about Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Gulagu.net reports he's identified as Igor Salikov, a former GRU officer and senior Wagner instructor. This could be pretty big. There's lots of sort of news about this. Here's a translation in image form of his affidavit. There's apparently a risk he will be deported along with his family, as the ICC has so far refused his surrender. In the affidavit, he claims he was ordered to execute 5 Ukrainian civilians in Bucha. Instead, he released them and fled. And in fact, the claims here include the idea that the war crimes came from the top, literally from the Kremlin. Like the sanctioned war crimes went down the list of the ladder of command. Anyway, that could be really significant going forward. We keep an eye on that, see where it goes. And here we have Russian media reporting a line to buy cheaper fish in the Russian city of Voronezh. We've heard of egg shortages. We've heard of bread shortages. There's a fish shortage, and now Russian media reporting egg queues have reached the Russian city of Krasnoyarsk. So further egg shortages, fish shortages, or at least cheap fish shortages. That's a massive queue there. These are all indicators that all is not economically well within Russia. That was a huge video. I do apologize it took so long. There's an awful lot to talk about today. Take care. Speak soon.